I'm in Germany, so I'm going to start on time. I mean, you know, the stereotypes do actually work out. I mean, go to a Magento event in Barcelona or something, and you'll start about 15 minutes late, and have dinner at 11 p.m. And so I'm Ben Marks. There we go. That's a little better. So I work at Magento. I've been playing around with Magento since 2008. Since about 2008, I think, and started probably like many of you. How many of you who I can't see? How many of you are currently working with Magento? Wow, there's actually a lot of people who aren't. He's going to help me out. We go way back. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. All right, so there's all my information up there. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, please at least get my contact info. If you have any questions or ideas, I'm one of the people at Magento with whom you can share those. Part of my job is actually to take input from existing developers or developers coming into the ecosystem and get it back to the product team so that they kind of get that feedback to know that what they're making, works well, or occasionally, what doesn't work well. I kind of got my start in the sort of the broader Magento world when I started doing their developer education, which I've done for several years now. It's the most riveting week of training you can ever have, right, in software. So I'll talk a little bit more about our education program later on. But for now, let's look at Magento 2 in real life. That actually is a screenshot of it. I probably can't even pull it up here. I don't like to do too many live demos. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. Also, I want to thank Shopware for my beautiful Magento mug. It was really nice of them to do. I'll have to see them May 20th. They've got their community day in Aarhus, and I'm sure I'll hear about that. So for those of you who are Magento developers, how many of you are currently working on a Magento 2 project? Show of hands. Wow, a few of you. Okay, that's great. The rest of you, get cracking. Magento 2 is a bit of a change from how we did things in Magento 1. So you can see we've redone the customer sort of the customer side of things, the front end interface, right? What the customer sees. There's a lot of improvements there behind the scenes. What we did was a lot of user testing. It's actually an important part of building a product which will be used by users. So we brought people in. We found some of the pain points, both for the front end and for the back end. So the back end is actually it's quite nice. It's quite nice to work with. If you have been a Magento 1 developer, then you have gone through the curious requirements of maybe adding a column, for example, to a product grid, which requires overriding PHP classes and so forth. In Magento 2, this is or should be something that you can actually do with XML. We looked at not just the user interface, but also some of the pain points for developers. So we kind of moved our navigation over to the left side. That's big stuff. This all became touchscreen friendly. I guess I should back up. I mean, I started going to PHP conferences before I joined Magento, and I would wear a Magento shirt. And it's like you have a bullseye, like right there. People will come up and they'll point at you. Because in 2013, Magento 1 was really showing its age, right? Work on Magento 1 started like December of 2006, right? So the framework, all of the e-commerce idiom built into the application, that stuff was pretty dated, right? I mean, I don't know. People would come up and say, why is Magento 1 so hard to test? Why didn't you build it for testability? I'm saying, well, I don't know how many of you were building testable or tested PHP applications in 2007. Not many were. And then, of course, the way that, part of the reason that we had to change from 1 to 2 was because, well, commerce is changing along with development, along with PHP, the language. So all of these kind of changes we rolled up into this major release that kind of facilitated some of what you see here, including the ability, I think I have a laser. Yes, including the ability, is it on here or is it here? No, maybe? Yeah. You can drag columns around. So from a user side, this actually eliminates a requirement, a custom development requirement. Users can actually save column order and filters and so forth. It sounds small, but it actually there's a lot of like merchandisers and different people working for merchants, and some of basically their workflow is literally go into the admin, look at a grid, and make sure it's prepared in some certain way so they can do reporting or whatever merchandising work they have to do. Now, underneath, this has all become much easier to work with than it was in M1. And then I guess it just occurred to me while I was talking about framework and application, for those of you who don't know, maybe you heard a little bit of our dialogue earlier this morning, Magento is two things. It is a framework, just a PHP MVC framework. Not really based on Zend. It has its own MVC approach with sort of XML configured views, kind of taking a playbook from a page from the Java playbook. So it's a framework first, and then the e-commerce application was built on top of that. Now in Magento 1, everything was pretty much bound together. You really you didn't have the application without the framework. Magento 2, we kind of abstracted a good bit, and I'll introduce some of that. So if you know, I guess another big takeaway besides my contact information is what's changed, what's the same, meaningfully. So if you know Magento 1, if you're a good Magento 1 developer, and I assume all of you are, or will be, talk to me later. No, if you are, so if you're an experienced Magento 1 developer, and that is a good, with good experience, not editing the core or anything like that, a lot of what you know from Magento 1 ports forward to Magento 2. So if you're familiar with layout XML, like it's a little bit different, but the concepts are very much the same. We're still very much, we're very configuration heavy in Magento. Requiring people to declare how the system is set up, it's necessary for flexibility. Magento, if you're not experienced with it, you have really, really small merchants who are doing, maybe a dozen orders a month or something, and they installed it themselves. They knew a little PHP, they figured it out, they maybe even customized it a little bit. But Magento, one of the reasons it was so successful from the beginning is because it satisfied the really, really small merchants, but it also adapted well to larger enterprises. So you have this gamut. You have this entire range of merchant size that Magento can use. Now, in order to do that, of course, you have to have a lot of configuration. It's actually one of the challenges that we're working on. There are actually groups and companies that release localized builds. I mean, for example, there's a lot of configuration. Magento is essentially a US-centric product. There's a lot of configuration that doesn't matter for the German market. I mean, so there are localized German builds. Magento is one of the companies or one of the brands that has got local builds that kind of help you get a quick start on Magento. That's actually the reason I mention it is because if you have any input about, hey, if I am installing for a German merchant, the system should automatically be set like so. That's the kind of input I'd love to get while I'm here. So we still have the same MVC approach. Again, it's XML configuration of views. Now, if you know PHP MVC, it's really easy. I mean, you hit an entry point, request gets routed, eventually to some point in execution where it gets handled, and then In that controller action, that's where you defer to, if you want to, you can defer to Magento's whole layout system. The idea is that you model a page in XML and that you can actually sort of say what shows up where and when with just a little bit of markup. It's quite nice once you get used to it. Until you get used to it, though, it really sucks. I used to hate layout XML, by the way, for several years. Once you get used to it, once you understand it, though, Magento really, it opens up what you can do, and you can get a lot of things done quickly. For example, the view model approach that layout XML requires allows a non-technical, sort of a non-back-end person. So let's say you're working in the front end, and the boss says, "Hey, I want on a certain route, let's say, in the customer account area, I want recently viewed products to show up in the left-hand column." That should be something that you can do with just a little bit of layout XML. You don't actually have to go in and grab a recent product collection and add it, and then sort of calculate that as part of the route or anything, because the blocks of content are essentially a marriage of a template and a PHP class. And when that PHP class is initialized, it can initialize whatever data it needs. Let's see. I'm sorry. The ORM for now is very much the same. I'm hearing things from my Ukrainian colleagues that there may be some adjustments coming to the ORM, but that's going to be down the road. I don't know if that'll be 2.1, 2.2, well, it won't be 2.1. It'd be probably 2.2 or 2.3. I won't promise, though. I'm not on the product team, so you'll hear about that more when we get there. But for now, it's very simple. A single entity is represented as a model. Data access goes through the resource model, and then you have collections, which are just built to model groups of things. Very easy to work with, very easy to set up, just a few classes. There is a command line interface tool for Magento 1. It's pretty meager. Most people, if you're working with Magento 1, you use Nets 98, Mage Run. It's a great community tool. Christian Munch is kind of the person coordinating that whole effort, but there's lots of community contribution to that. Again, that is Mage Run. Now, in Magento 2, we have our command line interface, and it is much, much more robust. It does a lot of things. And you'll recognize that it's actually based on Symfony console, the Symfony CLI component, which is just absolutely wonderful. N98 Mage Run is actually also present for Magento 2. I'm sorry, for Magento 2, but we actually talked with Christian about our needs to see if we could just work with the Mage Run sort of little community, but we actually wanted to have, we ended up both mutually deciding it would be good for us to have our own tool. And in fact, if you're a developer, you really need to be well-versed in it. I'll talk a little bit about that more later on. So, what else is new? Who has heard horror stories about working with Magento 1? Anyone? I'll say if no hands go up, then I'm assuming everyone's just tired from lunch. But so yeah, it's really interesting watching very good developers come into the Magento ecosystem, right, and encounter Magento for the first time. I've seen it. I've taught the Magento 1 fundamentals class like 40 times. So that's like 40 weeks of working with often very new Magento developers. And you can be frustrated because it is its own framework, so it's doing things in its own way, and that takes a little getting used to. It's just like coming into a job, a new job where you're a programmer and you're having to deal with some legacy system, right? Someone else did it the way they saw fit. But there were some obvious pain points as we started looking at Magento 1 to Magento 2, and really, for the past 6 or 7 years, if you were working just heads down in Magento 1, you were kind of in a bubble, right? You were the rest of PHP development, like Composer comes along, all these different cool things, testing, and everything comes into vogue, and you're just sitting here knocking out requirements for merchants. So when it came time to catch up, we talked not only to existing Magento developers, we also spoke at length with the people out in the community. I spend a good bit of my time when I'm on the road. Very often I'll run into some of the real luminaries in the PHP world, including people like Jordi Badiano, who is one of the big people behind the Composer project. And we have these conversations about expectations that people have when they come into a project. So these days, if you are dealing with a modular system, you expect to go to one place where you find all of the code and assets related to that module. So we wanted to make that a reality in Magento 2. We also wanted to use Composer. We wanted Composer to be the glue that binds not just external libraries, but also our own core. So our core is actually, if you look, there's a Composer manifest in the root of your Magento install, and that's what stitches everything together. And we're relying on a lot of open source packages out there. Again, we really wanted to make sure that Magento 2 would make more sense to gifted, talented PHP developers. Really, the user story there is as a capable PHP developer, a capable, sophisticated, modern PHP developer, I should open up the Magento core and not go, what the hell? And I think we got there. I've actually been pleasantly surprised to see people who I know had maybe in the past found Magento 1 to be unsavory based on their expectations. They come to me and said, "Oh, hey, we've got a Magento 2 project." Stefan Hochdorfer, who probably a lot of you know, said this to me earlier this year, and I couldn't be more pleased. So PSR adoption, we wanted to. I think if you have a public project, of course you have to follow PHP standard recommendations. We have a couple of little things that we're going to have to change, some BC breaks as far as code style goes. But I'm actually glad to say that we're also now a member of PHP Fig, which is the group behind the PHP standard recommendations. So we're very much involved with that. We have complete and configurable dependency injection. There should not be any hard-coded dependencies. And let me tell you, that was a lot of work. I didn't have to do it, thank God, but someone did it, and that was a lot of work for them. I hope we paid them well. We also, so with dependency injection, with this whole sort of meta space that creates, and I'll show a couple of examples later, we're actually using that because Magento 2 is a much bigger core. There's a lot deeper abstraction. So we're actually doing code generation based on how you configure dependency injection. So we actually generate class definitions based on this stuff. It's kind of interesting to get used to, and people can get dogmatic about whether it's good or bad. But if you're working with Magento 2, you're dealing with it. Cool. Other things that are new structurally in Magento 1, controller actions, there's real tight binding, of course, with the path to a controller class and the URL. That is in some ways still there, but each controller class is essentially just one action. It contains the execute method. That helps with testability and really helps us kind of continue to, as much as we can, obey single responsibility principle. You'll see a lot of us trying to do well by solid, for example, in the Magento 2 core compared to Magento 1. Another thing that we did was we built the whole thing for testability. It's really, when you think about the number of commerce stores that are online that don't have tests backing up what they do, it ends up adding a lot of effort, cost, and heartache when it comes to deployments. And there are some really great organizations and some really great minds behind continuous delivery with Magento 1. AOE is a fantastic company here, based here in Germany. They also have an office in the States. I think they're in Wiesbaden. They've done some really innovative things, solving a really tough challenge. But the good news is with Magento 2, your tests are there, and so unit tests actually live inside the module, and then all other manner of tests live in a separate directory. But the good news is that there's tests, so you actually know when you write something whether you're breaking something else. In Magento 1, that was often accomplished by you having the merchant call and say, no one can check out. And it's a really bad outcome for a commerce store. So I think I've got a good little bit of time. Developer preparation. So one of the things that you have to do, I'm sure you know from your projects, especially if you're working with any of the frameworks, like there are certain tools. Like if someone comes into your project or into maybe your ecosystem, if you're like a Symfony 2 developer or something, there's advice that you can give him or her, right? To help them get going. And the same is true for Magento 2. So a couple of things that you, of course, need, and believe it or not, there are still people who try and work with large frameworks, applications like this, without using a proper IDE. It's really, you just can't do it anymore. Just trying to navigate, execution path. I mean, being able to step debug, being able to control click to get to class definitions, just the amount of typing that you save by having a great tool like PHP Storm, for example, do auto completion for you, extracting variables, etc. It really makes it makes no sense to not use these incredible tools. That we have at our disposal now. So a proper IDE, a proper step debugger are a must. There are actually multiple installation paths. And currently, right now, so if you've taken a look at Magento 2 and you have found it to be, you maybe had a tough time getting going, this is actually something that we're working in earnest on. It's one of the biggest stories that we're dealing with. We just had our fantastic annual conference last week. It's in Las Vegas every year. There's a great hackathon that happens right before that over the weekend. It's a great learning opportunity in Las Vegas to experience just all the the Magento community and everything. But at this hackathon, actually before it, the chief architect, essentially the VP, sort of the VP of getting things done there, Alan Kent, he was in the hackathon both days, the whole thing, and just working with the developers, hearing their pain points. We as a company really care about our ecosystem in general, and certainly the developers, because we're nothing. Like we can put Magento out, but it doesn't do anything for anyone without developers sort of carrying it the rest of the way, and that's why we have to make sure that the tooling and that the installation process work really well. So you can create projects via Composer. You can grab a file archive. Anyway, number of different ways to install Magento 2. We have all the documentation for it on our documentation site. That's another interesting thing. Difference between Magento 1 and Magento 2. We actually have documentation now. Imagine that. And our documentation team, they actually they reached out to me one day and they said, hey, we taught ourselves how to use Git. And so they literally, like, our documentation is, you can see it on GitHub, and you can contribute to it just via pull request. It was really cute. They care a lot too that the stuff that they're writing about is correct and that it matters to you guys. So in fact, it's just built via Jekyll. Magento 2, I have to admit, maintaining a web dev stack here was getting a little dodgy with OS updates and stuff, so I've switched to, I'm using Vagrant now. Up to you. Developers are doing it both ways. I think if you have to support multiple clients, then you really don't have a choice. You're probably going to have to go with virtualization, especially if you are working on Magento 1 and Magento 2 projects. Magento has a concept of modes. It had this in Magento 1. In Magento 2, there are 3, default, developer, and production. If you are developing, you probably want to be in developer mode, right? This just means you're going to get error reporting and things like that. Production mode assumes the application essentially just assumes that all of the assets that need to be materialized and generated, that everything's in the right place. Production mode expects things, essentially assumes that you've prepared the system and you've deployed it and it's just going to go. That actually reduces a lot of the overhead that the application would otherwise have to try and figure out, like, hey, okay, well, I need to initialize this class. Now let me go find the dependencies that it needs in order to initialize. All of this stuff just happens through materialization, generation, and just being put in production mode. Default mode means that you're using Magento and you don't know the difference. So probably every developer in this room, you should never, ever have a Magento instance in default mode. That is just kind of there for that remaining story, the mom and pop shop that just installs Magento and just kind of has a third-party theme, buys a couple of modules, and spins up their store. You'll also want PHP unit and Selenium so you can do testing. And as I mentioned before, learn the CLI. As far as customizations go, so I taught myself programming. I have a psychology degree. I was a professional drummer for a while, and then somehow ended up sitting down one day and writing code. I had to create a store for my friend's mom, and I found this cool thing called OS Commerce. And I'm like, okay, here's this big project that seems to be used everywhere. I'll use that to teach myself PHP. I then had to spend a couple years unlearning everything that I picked up in there. So OS Commerce by 2003 was already showing its age. PHP was moving on, becoming more sophisticated language. But I worked with OS, implemented OS Commerce sites for several years, right? And that was because that was really all we had. Now, in Germany, I think there were a few more options that were popular, but in any event, basically, anytime you needed to do customization, it was unmaintainable. Like, you're in the core, you're in the guts. Magento 1 really impressed me from the beginning because you could change core functionality or you could add to that functionality without breaking the core. You could do so essentially in an upgrade-safe manner. Magento 2, we actually have more customization tools at our disposal. And customization, flexibility really is kind of at the heart of what makes Magento, I think, work in so many cases. So we have this new thing called Interception. I'll have some code samples up here in just a second. Essentially, it is the idea, and this is trippy, so get ready. Essentially every public method in Magento 2 is sort of a hookable event. Right, so you can execute your custom code before that public method, after that public method, or around it, and work with the parameters. Now, there's probably a couple of different kinds of developers at this point listening to me. There are the developers who are maybe new and thinking about the possibilities and go, wow, that's really awesome. And then there are the developers maybe who have some experience and go, that is scary, scary shit. Because if you give developers a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? And we will see people doing really bad stuff with interception. But that's an easy problem to solve, and I think it's more important to get the capability out there. So working with interception, the feedback from the developer community so far has been really positive in terms of overall architecture. We still have also have a new way. DI configuration. So again, you can set preferences for different class instances. We use constructor-based injection, and it just goes off of type hinting. But you can rely on the defaults. So, like for example, if an order object needs a customer object, you can actually change which class that customer object is, just via XML. It's an interesting option. It's kind of akin to rewrites, or I guess I would say analogous to rewrites in Magento 1, which is the ability to permanently system-wide change. If you requested a customer object, you could actually point that to a different class. We also still have our event system. So this is just a, it's an event system like you might encounter in, many PHP applications. Just sort of a kind of a global, hey, this thing is happening right now, and here's a couple of important bits that you might want to work with. For example, adding a product to a cart. Events have, because events happen in context, they just have a contextual quality to them, they're still quite useful. So internally, Magento, actually the application, Magento 2, uses Interception, uses the event system to function. It's not like this stuff is just there for customization. We actually implement some of our own core functionality this way. And that was just so that we could build things the right way, sort of decoupled, modular, replaceable, but then still get the behavior that we wanted. And we used to have, through file system vagary, sort of loading definitions, preferentially from different class definitions from different paths. That used to be kind of a hacky way to rewrite functionality. That is gone, thankfully. So let's take a look at Interception. This is an Interception. This is what gives rise to our plugin system. So when you hear Interception and plugin talked about in Magento 2, we're essentially talking about the same thing. So in XML you define, you say, hey, I've got this plugin, and then based on some pattern matching, you end up with this thing right here would just write a log entry before the dispatch method is called in whatever class it's being called in. Again, that would be defined in XML. Actually, this might be bad. If dispatch is returning something, you also need to make sure you return here, or else you get some bad behavior. Bugs, I think they're called. We don't spend too much time writing buggy code. That's a joke. Our dependency injection looks like this. So again, it's all constructor based, and I will say that we actually have some legacy here. So if you open up, my favorite thing to do is when you start thinking about how great an approach this is to just inject things contextually at the constructor level. It's really awesome then when you say, okay, now go open up the sales order object. This is the class that represents an order, and you'll see about 25 objects required. So that's bad in case you didn't know, right? That's an object that's doing way too much. I've hopes that eventually we'll get in to refactor that, but I don't know that we will. Maybe not. That comes from the days of Magento 1. And it was interesting when we actually converted a lot of the Magento 1 code into Magento 2, and some of these smells became quite evident. At the very least was an indication that we have the right approach, right? Because that obviously says, like, hey, this thing is doing way too much. It's going to be really hard to test. But in general, there's no direct instantiation of a class inside another class anywhere. Any dependency required is injected through the constructor. And again, you can get dogmatic about dependency injection approaches. The one that we took, I think, works well for us given our requirements. Integration. So I'm going to tell you what I have been told. I also, if any of you are currently have experience with this stuff, or if you don't have experience but get some down the road, feel free to ping me. We always want to know that what we're saying, the idea that we have about our product, is matching the reality about our product. But from what I understand, with some changes to how our routing works and how the API is implemented, the API operations are substantially faster in Magento 2. We also have this idea called service contracts. Now, ideally, this all would have been there at launch, but implementing service contracts, this is essentially interfaces to represent data or actions. And this implementation actually went through a couple of iterations, or this facet went through a couple of implementations while we were developing Magento 2. So you'll see some artifacts in there, things like repositories, et cetera. Unfortunately, the only complete service contract implementation is in the customer module. But ideally, so the whole idea behind service contracts is that really this will be the way to do integrations from in the future. Essentially, you're going through one interface, one place, and whether it's an API call or whether it's actually you're rendering something from Vue, you're going through the service contract. Nach 10 Minuten. Cool. Front end is a challenge. I recently had to ping about 30 or 40 people because we're building out these developer profiles. Essentially, we want our architects and our engineers to be building stuff in a way that makes sense to the rough categories of developer that we have out there. And maybe one of the blind spots for us is front end development. Front end development has changed a lot. I haven't had to do front-end development in a while. So if you said, Ben, I want rounded corner buttons, I would get out my image editor and draw a rounded thing, and I'd cut it, and a little CSS later, we're good to go. That, of course, is not how you're supposed to do it these days. And the tooling and all the process and everything that goes into front-end development. You've got compilation, you've got mix-ins, a lot of stuff that can simplify the workflow. We try to facilitate that as much as we can. Now, our standard themes are actually, we built using less. Now, I will say that we have jQuery, not prototype anymore. So jQuery is Magento 2. But the less Sass thing is sort of like another prototype jQuery thing for us. The reason we went with less, by the way, is if you look in our dependencies, there is Oye Jorge, and that is a server-side less preprocessor. And we wanted that because we want to facilitate people whose workflow, is, hey, I'm gonna get in deep and I'm gonna own all of this CSS space, and I've got I've got Grunt and Gulp and all this stuff set up to work locally, as well as developers who don't want to do that and they're just going to let the server build your CSS. But I will say that we've implemented, given the modularity, the true abstraction of even the framework away from the core modules. You can actually swap out, pretty much anything. A great story there was when we had a developer beta meeting in Austin, Texas last January. We brought out a guy named Cyril Schumacher. Is that you, Cyril? Hey, okay, I'm going to tell the story. You've heard the story. That's Cyril. He's smart. He's probably actually writing something really cool in Go right now back there. We know, by the way, teachers, we know. You're sitting in the back. You're just sitting there doing work from a cool location. But basically, he was there, and someone said, well, you're still using PHTML. Wouldn't it be great if you had, if you were using Twig for templating? And the great thing about flying a German, 15 hours, is that, he or she's going to have 15 hours to go back on a plane. And what else are you going to do but write, cool modules when that happens? So by the time we landed, it was actually really possible and not even all that complicated to have an alternate template parser, right? Same thing works for less. You can swap out and implement Sass if you want. Now, of course, you have to build out the corresponding assets, right? Because, so if you have a Twig parser, that doesn't do you much good unless you implement the templating in Twig as well. But again, the important thing to note is that it's not hard-coded, it's possible. Like one line of dependency injection and you've swapped out your template parser. Let's see. So UI components, I won't go into too much more detail there. I'd actually love to get a couple of questions. Essentially, we wanted to componentize how you build things like grids, other widgets. There's also some interesting, on the JS side of things, we're using RequireJS to handle, the sort of the complex merging of all sorts of things. It's possible to swap out JS objects via this mixins construct. I don't know anything about that. I can point you to the person who built it. From a performance standpoint, well, you may be aware of like some notorious white papers being released by us, by others. I'd say at this point, performance is an evolving story for Magento 2. There are expectations as to how to configure your production environment so that it runs well. We do have, we have published some pretty good numbers in terms of order throughput and things like that. And our stuff is out there. You should be able to reproduce our tests. And if you see us publishing benchmarks or making statements about that don't match with your experience, when you try and duplicate that, that's something I want to hear about because, we should know. There's also, as part of the differentiation between enterprise and community, so full-page caching became part of community, just via Varnish and a VCL configuration builder. But with EE, we're actually going for scale. So things like native job queuing via RabbitMQ and separate database support for actually for orders. And we also, with EE, you can also do MySQL clustering. A big announcement. So we have a couple of big announcements. One is, of course, our cloud. So we're doing a platform as a service now. That is just announced a few days ago. Also just released is, and there's going to be more details about that, over the next month or so. Also just released the Magento Marketplace. That's our replacement for Magento Connect. Magento Connect is still going to be there, but we are taking a much more hands-on approach. This is an app store model with RevShare. We actually host the code ourselves, so we make sure it doesn't suck and that it's not stolen. So you're going to see much fewer extensions, like probably by an order of magnitude, fewer extensions going forward, because no marketplace needs 40 different extensions to put a Facebook like button on the product page. Some resources. Of course, GitHub. This is where a lot of good discussion happens. We have several people from the community, two of them actually from Germany. Damian and Vinay are part of this team. So we have an incredible volume. We have a lot of open issues. A lot of those are discussion. A lot of those are just please for help. But please, if you have anything to say, contribute either by commenting on issues or submitting a pull request. We also have migration tools to get you from Magento 1 to Magento 2. Everything you can pretty much see under github.com/Magento. We have our documentation site, which I mentioned. We also have our official public forum, and then, of course, the Magento Stack Exchange. A couple of good blogs to follow. Alan Kent, who is our chief architect, is an exceptionally good information conveyor. And then, of course, Alan Storm, whose name we always say with respect, sort of the godfather of the Magento developer world. He's been plugging away at Magento 2, both programmatically and philosophically. If you get on his blog, you'll see what I mean. Vinay Kopp, my good friend and colleague from here in Neckargemünd, he is doing some screencasts of testing in Magento 2, so mage2katas.com. Really quite good stuff there. And then if you want to spin up, probably the easiest way to get going, Mage2 Vagrant. There are others as well out there, and there are solutions, there are options for Docker, etc. Oh, sorry, people are taking pictures. You got it all? Cool. We have training, which is something we didn't have when we launched Magento in 2008. Yeah, that's good. So we have training. You can see the catalog there. Sometimes I teach those classes, not too often, but sometimes I do. Sometimes they also let smart people teach it. There's actually one coming up in Barcelona, which is actually, I think there are more Germans in Barcelona every time I go there than there are Spaniards. I get it, it's warm. Yep. So, oh, it's right at time, isn't it? Okay, I had a couple minutes. Let's do some questions. Yes, you, way in the back. How do you calculate, the question is, how do you calculate the final price of a product in Magento 2? So the danger of becoming an evangelist is that you're writing less code, doing less customizations. But I'm pretty sure from, based on my, so if you dig in the totals calculation, architecture, it's there just underneath the hood, the same, essentially similar to Magento 1. And of course, that means it depends. If you're finding inconsistencies, though, that's definitely something I want to hear about. So how's that for a diplomatic answer? It is, totals calculation sucks. There's actually a legendary, go into Google, look up GraphViz, which is a tool hopefully you know, GraphViz and Magento totals, and you're going to end up on a Stack Overflow post, and you're going to see it looks like someone just threw up black spaghetti in terms of like all of the different sorting orders. It's actually not an easy problem to solve unless you're explicit and you say, okay, this is the order of calculation, and this depends on this and is additive. And the problem is that totals calculation, well, in some places you need to, you've got tax, and in some places you need to tax the shipping amount. Some places you need to tax the non-discounted amount. Some place you only tax the discounted amount. And this changes as you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So really, when you encounter complexity or difficulty in Magento, don't blame Magento, blame humanity. Because we can't make up our own damn mind about how commerce would be, should do any one thing. Next question. Someone else want to ask me or give me shit about EAV today? Yes, you with the hand up. The question is, why did we not choose another language? Because we're not another company. It's a good question. I mean, the size, the heft, the tooling, everything about Magento 2 probably screams, or really even Magento 1. Well, hell, if you're a Java developer and you open up Magento Core, Magento 1 or Magento 2, you're probably going to go, oh yeah, that looks familiar. But really the answer is sitting right here. This PHP in general, and I know there are many, many PHP developers here. It's an incredibly accessible language, also successful. Also, if we did that, we would be effectively resetting everything amazing and good about Magento, which is our outstanding community. I have the easiest job in the world, right? Someone somewhere is like selling stuff and deals and licenses. I take some of that money. I get on airplanes and I go talk. And most of the time that I'm talking, I'm actually speaking at events that are completely dedicated to Magento that I just have to show up. We didn't have to put them on. We only put on a few of our own big conferences a year. Everything else is done by the community. When you see those Meet Magento events, which by the way, go. They're fantastic. Meet Magento is a German nonprofit organization from Leipzig. It's not even our company. It's a great community, and if we built Magento in Java, forget it. Goodbye, Magento. It'd be Magentava. Okay, I'll take one more question. Yes, in the middle here.
How many installations are already launched? Why should I take the effort to upgrade?
Good question. So the question was, how many instances are launched, and why should you take the effort to upgrade from 1 to 2? And this is where I get to prove that I'm not from marketing or sales, because I'll say stuff that probably would make them irate, or will. I guess they're recording this. I assume someone reviews this stuff. Let's see. So, what was the first question? Oh, how many installations? So this is one of the challenges of open source. We don't know. Like, I mean, you can download Magento 2 and launch a store right now, and I'm not going to know. So we do have several that we know about. We launched with there were a few enterprise level sites live at launch. We worked extensively with solution partners and merchants to make that happen. I know the download stats, we just actually had, there's a lot of good Magento 2 content, by the way, that will be posted onto our Imagine Magento website, which is our conference. Those should be live within probably a couple weeks. But I believe the download stats that our CEO, Mark Lavelle, mentioned at Imagine, I want to say it was like 50,000 downloads so far, maybe 100,000. That's probably something I should know, so marketing rightfully will yell at me about that. Now, why should you make the change? Why should you make the switch? It depends, and maybe you shouldn't. You know, if you've got a Magento 1 merchant, they've got everything they need, they're not going to have those needs expand anytime. Everything's working great for them. Well, Magento 2, I'm saying Magento 3. Magento 1 is supported through November 2018. So that's a nice long ramp. We didn't want to force people. We want people on 2. But what's going to happen, though, is, I mean, think about how you were buying stuff online, 2 or 3 years ago. It changes. Probably you're going to want your client, those needs, or maybe if you are the client, your needs are going to change most likely. Magento 2 also, as we go through our quarterly release cadence, which will start sometime soon, 2.1 will come out in the near future. No definition of near future. Could be 2 years. No, I'm kidding. It'll be out soon. That is, you'll see more and more features for free. And it could be that some of those features your client needs, and that actually just offsets the cost of migrating. And then I'm totally over time and taking up the room. So I'm going to say goodbye. I'll be around. I'll look the same. I'll probably still have on a Magento sticker. By the way, if you are a certified Magento developer or solution specialist, I actually have die-cut stickers. I know, Fabian, you're happy. So please come find me. We'll talk Magento. It's beautiful. Thanks a lot to Spryker and others for putting this on. Appreciate it.